regional level as well, but at the global level, just to see where they go on their journey from the field to our mouths and other places. So up here we have, this is the nearly 6,000 calories per person per day of human edible crops that we grow. Isn't that fantastic? It's about 2.5 times what we need to eat. I'm only going to talk through the calories here, but just to say that we did this for protein and vitamin A and iron and zinc, and you get a very similar story for all of them. So we grow this much, and also our farm animals eat this much grass and pasture and stover that we can't eat, but they can. That's another nearly 4,000 calories kind of in the system, although it's not edible to humans. And then what happens to it? So we lose a little bit there in harvest losses, and we could trim that. We should do things to trim that down. And we lose a little bit in storage, and we should do things to trim that down as well. That's mainly a developing country problem for just lack of storage facilities. But there's still plenty. And then this is the interesting stage where we work out what to do with it. And the little yellow sliver at the top is the bit that we save for seeds so that we can plant them and eat next year as well. That's a really good idea. Then the blue bit is non-food uses, and that is mainly biofuel. Not entirely, but it's mainly biofuel, which isn't bad as such, but just to give you an idea of the trade-off between food and biofuel, in case anyone's thinking that biofuel is the solution to the energy transition. If you get enough wheat to feed me for a day, or give me all the calories I need for a day, but instead you use that wheat to create biofuel to power my little Peugeot 107 car, you could power that car for 1 mile. Right? So that's the trade-off, 1 mile against a day's worth of calories for a person. It's an incredibly steep trade-off. Now, you could do things like a second-generation biofuel. You might get it up to 4 or 5 miles or something, but it's still an incredibly steep trade-off. So, and if we let market forces do their thing on biofuels as we leave the fossil fuel in the ground, then the danger is that the pressure that puts on both biodiversity and the food supply could be absolutely enormous. So this green chunk here we keep in the human food system, that's great. And then this chunk here, 1,740 calories per person per day, is inherently edible, human edible food, and we feed it to farm animals. So the farm animals eat this and they eat that, and they give us back this red slither here, nearly 600 calories per person per day, and they lose all this. And that's by doing all the inefficient things that animals do, like spending energy walking around the place, keeping warm, and some of them even spend some of it creating methane. Or some of it goes on methane. So the biggest story in this whole map is that if we could just stop feeding human edible food to farm animals, we would liberate so much more capacity in the food system to feed a rising population and deal with our biodiversity while we're at it. And we mapped all that out as well, and we said that if you don't factor in the fact that our land might get less fertile as a result of climate change, then it looks like with the right dietary change and the right trimming down of those losses, there's no reason why we shouldn't feed a 2050 population. And actually, we don't need to all go vegetarian or vegan. We actually don't need to all go all the way. Some of this land should be used for biodiversity, and some of it is fit for crops, and we probably should be using it for crops. But there's no reason why some of it isn't for farm animals as well. It's not clear cut that we all need to go 100% vegetarian and vegan, but it is clear cut that we need to see a lot of dietary change, especially in countries like ours. Okay, and then just to follow the story on, we lose a bit in processing and distribution and consumer waste. And if we did this for the UK, that bar would look thicker. And then we net over consumption, we eat a bit more than we need. But there's still enough to go around. So the other big headline from this picture is that there is actually enough food in the world, and there's enough of every nutrient in the world. And the reason why not everybody gets enough is nothing to do with the lack of supply. It's to do with that the supply chains don't find their way to every mouth. And the reason for that is that in the market economy that we've got, supply chains only go where the money points them, and not everybody has enough money for the supply chains to bother to make sure that they've got access to the nutrition they need to be healthy. And you know what? You could double the food supply, and if you didn't sort that out, you'd still have people going malnourished. Okay, just to emphasize the inefficiency of animals with one slide here. just comparing 100 grams of soybeans with 100 grams of beef, and you see the soybeans in green have just got more, and I could have put more nutrients on this that the soybeans win on as well. They just have more in them than the beef. And yet, if you feed 100 grams of soybeans to a cow, the cow will give you something like 10 grams of beef back again. So there's just an enormous loss of nutrition. And when soybeans get a bad reputation, get a bad name for deforestation, it's not because of the soybeans. Don't blame the soybeans, blame the fact that we're feeding them to cows. And then this is just adapted a little bit from a paper in Science by Joseph Poore and others. And it's just illustrating the greenhouse gas emissions from 50 grams of protein from different sources. And you can see the ruminant animals at the top and then the other animals. And this message, by the way, has really come out in the last 18 months. And, you know, most people have heard this before now. I should just speed up. But just to emphasize, all the plant-based proteins, massively less emissions associated with them. Now, I said this is just a quick tour. I haven't talked of the food system. I haven't talked at all about fish, but it's clearly a component in it. And so one of the questions in the book is, when is a sea bass not a sea bass? And that's my way into talking about the role of fish and how we need to manage our fish supplies much better and how we need to deal with unregulated fishing and all kinds of things that I won't go into now. So I'm just going to say the answer to this question, just for speed. I'm just going to have to say, well, I'm afraid you'll have to buy the book. And then my one slide on plastic, my one statistic on plastic is that if you took all the discarded plastic in the world, if it was in the form of cling film, you could wrap the whole planet up 1.5 times over. That's just in the last 50 years, and we're producing it faster than ever. Okay, finally on to energy and climate. I'm not going to talk a lot about this because you hear so much about it, but there are some things that still really need emphasizing because the message isn't out there. And this is a curve of emissions from fossil fuel use, CO2 from fossil fuel use. And you can see that that curve is going up exactly as we would have predicted it might have done if humans had never noticed that climate change was an issue that we had to deal with. And I am choosing my words carefully here. I'm not saying it to be depressing, but we need to get our heads around this. There is not a trace of evidence that that curve has responded to us noticing climate change. It hasn't noticed the Paris talks or the UK targets or any of the actions that any of us in this room have taken to try and do the right thing. So that's pretty shocking, right? We have no agency over this yet. Humanity has no agency over that curve yet. I'm not saying this to be depressing. I'm saying this because if we can face that reality and ask ourselves properly what it means, it will tell us an awful lot about what won't solve the problem, and it could tell us an awful lot about what it will take to get on top of it. So why is it that we see no dent when we know that there are so many small actions going on all over the place? And the answer is that if you stand back and look at this at the global system level, you find that it's a bit like squeezing a balloon. You get these things called rebound effects, where you get a saving in one place or an efficiency improvement in one place. And actually what you find at the global system level is that that saving in one place enables and encourages the rest of the balloon to expand in a complementary way. So does that mean it's impossible to bring that curve down? No, it doesn't. But it does tell us that we need to interrupt the dynamics of emissions growth at the global system level. It means nothing else will do. So when Extinction Rebellion talk about system change, that's part of what they mean, because we do need big global systems. We need to interrupt that curve at the global system level. And actually, when you really look at it, just in terms of climate change, there's no doubt that we need to leave the fossil fuel in the ground. We need a global arrangement that succeeds in leaving all the world's fossil fuels in the ground. Not one country doing it, not a few countries doing it. Actually, the world's fossil fuel needs to stay in the ground. We can dig a little bit more up. And then, this is how much fossil fuel there is in the world, and this is how much we can burn just to stay within 2 degrees, which of course now we know is a desperately dangerous thing to do. And some good news about our awareness is that used to be a controversial thing to say, and now everybody gets it, which is great. And now on to the most the most fascinating and the critical part of the whole climate change phenomenon, which is just to look at the human reaction to it. And, because if only it was a bit of science and technology, we'd be there, we'd have sorted it out already. But, this is the really good news that I want to say, which is I think over the last 12 to 15 months, the evidence that that head is finally trying to come out of the sand is a lot stronger than it has ever been before. I mean, a lot stronger. And it's got a long way to go. But if you were trying to pull that head out the sand, it would be the first millimetre of movement would be the hardest bit, wouldn't it? And, we don't know, but I would say that maybe the first millimetre has happened, and now if we all push really, really hard, it might not be long at all before that head really pops out. Humanity wakes up and we get on the case. And I think it will feel, when that happens, I think it will feel brilliant. Because we'll know, finally, instead of having this kind of nagging sense that we've all got, that we know that we're just all living life in a way that's completely conflicted with how it should be going, we'll actually know that we may have left it very late, but at least we'll know that now we're doing the right thing. Okay, so let's have a look physically at what this challenge is. Oh, so I meant to take some of the words off this, but just don't worry about the words. This is our energy supply, this is the oil, gas and coal, and this 5% here is the bit that we still take in through our mouths. 5% of our energy supply still comes to us through our mouths. And then there's wood, and if you look really carefully, you can see this green sliver here that represents the sun and the wind and other renewable sources other than hydro and nuclear. Nuclear is not renewable. And the challenge, in a really short space of time, is to expand this so that it can replace all of these. And I've got some slides on how that's possible, but I just want to emphasize one thing, which is that if we were to do that while still growing our energy supply at the 2.4% per year that we've been averaging over the last 50 years, that's a factor of 10 every century, or a double up by 2050, we could have the green slice looking as big as this, and you know what? It would have done us no good whatsoever, because we'd just be having the renewables as well as the fossil fuel. And we need to have the renewables instead of the fossil fuel. And for that to happen, the world has got to use less energy. And we need to be, it's a very, very simple concept. We need to be really clear about it. We need to call out the fossil fuel companies when they gloss over it. It's a kind of an uncomfortable reality for some people, but it's not uncomfortable. We've got all the efficiency improvements to live really well with less energy, but we do need that discipline. And in this country in particular, we can and have to find ways of actually living really well, better than ever, on less energy than we're using at the moment. Blank slide. Okay, it's now some really good news. It's high time for some good news. So that black dot is to scale, and it represents the size of solar panels that we would need in the world to replace the whole of humanity's current energy supply, 228 miles by 228 miles. And there's a lot more complexity in it. We need to get the energy to everywhere, and what about when the sun's not shining, and what about all our infrastructure that relies on liquid hydrocarbons and so on. But the good news is that actually all those technical challenges are solvable, and we can produce that many solar panels to do it. It's a huge challenge, and we can supplement it with bits of wind and tide and other stuff. They're not as important as the sun. But from the technical perspective, it is a doable challenge. As long as we don't, just to say it again, as long as we don't grow the energy supply. If we did grow the energy supply, that one dot would have to look like that in 100 years' time, and like that in 200 years' time, and like that in 300 years' time, with no bit of the Earth's land area available for anything other than solar panels. So no human would be allowed to have sunlight landing on them unless they were at sea. So we need to stop growing our energy supply at some point, but actually that moment is now. Who gets the sunlight? So when we talk about leaving the world's fossil fuel in the ground, well, we need to share out who's going to get the energy supply that, from the different sources it's coming from, and how is that going to work? And somehow this deal is going to have to be acceptable at the global level. So I just put this chart up of where that sunlight is, And I'm not going to talk about it too much, but just to show, and the shading is the sunlight per person. So there we are, looking really pale because we're the 5th worst country in the world in terms of sunlight per person, just ahead of Bangladesh, Rwanda, the Netherlands and Belgium. And here is Australia. Don't know why it's digging any coal out of the ground still, because it's got 200 times more sunlight per person than we've got. And again, just quickly, some good news in terms of how we make this transition acceptable for everybody. If you actually look at the countries that have got the sunlight and map it against the 10 countries that have got the most fossil fuel reserves that are lined up there, you actually find that they line up pretty nicely most of the time. Most of the countries that would think of themselves as standing to lose the most by leaving the fuel in the ground are actually really well placed to substitute it for sunlight. And I just put this slide up. Wind is nothing like as important source of energy, but I just put it up because it's reassuring for us who live in the UK, because we've got a bit more wind, so we've grown a bit and we've got a bit more colour in our cheeks. So we can make the renewable transition work for us. It's just that compared to Australia, we have to do it through a whole range of different technologies. Okay, I'm going to keep going through the sort of all those things I put in green around the chart, just really quickly. So energy and transport, I'm not going to say much about this, but that's just all the miles that we do as people, 27 trillion of them. And that includes walking between the person who set the fire alarm off, walking between the toaster and the fridge or whatever, it includes every step that you take. It's been counted in the green chart up there. But the two things I want to put out is this is the driving, and we're doing more and more of it at the moment. And yes, we do need to electrify our transport, but we also need to reduce the amount that we drive, because the energy has to come from somewhere, and we need to reduce our energy supply. And electric cars still use an enormous amount of energy to be built and to be driven, and there are other environmental burdens around the batteries and stuff which are really, really critical as well. So that's the driving. And then the second thing I want to pull out is this line down here, which is the flying. And I said that we had all the technical solutions, but I just want to pull out that there is one critical area in particular where we don't actually have the solution, which is that we do not know how to put a long-haul aircraft into the sky without burning through something like 100 tons of fossil fuel. And we're miles away from the solution to that. And so it's absolutely clear that for the foreseeable future, we can still have some flying, but we are going to need to fly less. And that's something that the airlines are currently just hedging around and working out whether they dare face up to that or not. And some of them are just beginning to. It's, the low-carbon world can be a better world than the high-carbon world. There's no doubt about it. If we do the transition in the right way, it's a quality-of-life opportunity. But if there's one bit where we have to bite the bullet, that's it. It's on the flying. How am I doing on time? Okay, but I want to move on. Okay, so come the sustainable world, all our energy, all our land transport is going to require land in order to do it, one way or another. So this is just an analysis of what could you do with a square meter of land. I've chosen sunny Californian land to travel. You could either grow a grass crop, do a second generation biofuel and use it to power a car, or you could put wheat on the land and make a loaf of bread and power a cyclist, or you could put solar panels on and power a car, or you could put solar panels on and power an electric bike. Actually, it's not an electric bike, it's a scooter. So it's got no human pedaling, it's just purely electric in this. So let's have a look at how far you get. So first of all, and you might be able to see a little piece of string up there representing the 5 miles that you could get from your biofuel. 5 miles per year out of your square metre of land. Half that number if it's up in Cumbria where I live. The cyclist does much better on 25 miles, no surprises. The electric car, for all I said about electric cars, does a lot better on 1,000 miles. And the electric bike, I'm just about to buy one, it does an amazing 21,000 miles out of a square metre of land in a year. Isn't that fantastic? So electric bikes have got to be something on the way up. Okay, so I've talked a little about some of the stuff around the edge in green, and I want to talk about, and I've said that from a technical perspective, we can make the change. So I want to talk about what would it take for us to be solving these technically solvable challenges. And that takes us into all the stuff in blue there. So, you know, first of all, the whole growth question. We can't physically expand anymore because we've expanded into every corner of the planet just about. We can't grow our carbon emissions anymore. We can't grow our energy supply anymore. Is there anything that it's still okay to grow? Well, we can afford to, you know, we can aspire to grow biodiversity, absolutely for sure. We can aspire to grow well-being of ourselves and all the other species, you know, and we could put, you know, those kinds of growth could be really important. We can aspire to grow things like our capacity for global empathy, so that our ability to care about people on the other side of the world from different cultures that we're never going to meet. So there are all kinds of things that we do need to grow. Whether we grow GDP or not, actually, I know the debate rages about that. It's just an abstract human construction. GDP on its own has got no grounding in anything physical. So I could imagine a world where GDP goes up and our environmental impact goes down. I could definitely imagine a world that carries on as we are, in which our GDP goes up along with our rising environmental impacts. But you know, the truth of it is it's just not the right measure to be chasing. We need to find measures that are strongly connected to the health of the well-being of people and planet, and we need to pursue growth on those things only. But we also need to take all numerical metrics with a much bigger pinch of salt, because life is just a richer thing than any metric can capture. And if you fixate on any metric, then you end up doing perverse things that are just not in anyone's interests. So that's the growth debate. We need to change the flavor of our growth a lot. I've said that it's not surprising that our economics is not fit for purpose, because it's been honed in a different era, an era when we could expand. If you want a book on this, then Donut Economics is a really good, it's a really good start on that challenge. How do we reinvent that? Our relationship with technology also needs a big renegotiation, because technology has brought us many great things, and we need some technologies to get us out of the mess that we're in. We desperately need some of the new technologies. However, it is also true to say that technology has got us into the mess we're in. So what we need to get much better at now is being selective about which technologies we adopt and when, and asking ourselves, is this technology actually delivering a well-being benefit for people and planet? And if not, how do we leave it on the shelf, even if it's convenient and gives us an efficiency improvement? And at the moment, the way things go is we invent technologies because it's fun and because we can, and then it gives us an efficiency improvement, and we have a market economy, and in a market economy, if anybody adopts something that gives them an efficiency improvement, then everybody has to, otherwise you go out of business. And so we're all stuck with it, and the next thing you know, we've got all this technology, and we haven't actually chosen whether we want it or not. We've just got it. And going forwards, that is increasingly problematic. So how do we reinvent? How do we take agency, deliberate agency over the technologies that come our way? The challenge for business, and I'm working with a lot of different businesses now in all sorts of different sectors. The challenge for business is that here in the Anthropocene, it is not okay to exist primarily to make profit, and we'll try and be nice while we're at it and do no harm or do no evil or whatever, because the world is too fragile for that, and you will end up doing harm. So all organizations, universities included, have to exist for a primary purpose that is for the health, is connected to the health of people and planet. And nothing else will do. It's okay to make some money, but it's not okay to exist and we can debate how much money it's okay to make, but it's not okay to exist primarily to do that. Investment needs a really close look, and I'm having some very encouraging discussions with investment communities now, and the appetite for this discussion is much higher than I thought it would be. The investment has got to be about, can we push the world's trillions in the direction they need. So there's no room now for investing them in fossil fuels, but there are some technologies we really, really do need. And how can we get the whole investment community pushing the trillions in the right direction? What is that? Is that noise coming out of my machine? It's not, is it? No, okay. Inequality I've talked about, a little bit, but it's really central to if we're serious about dealing with the climate emergency, then it's going to take international global cooperation. And is that going to be possible in a world in which it's so clear that actually not everybody looks after the interests of everybody else? So that's something we absolutely have to, not as a nice to have, as we've always treated it throughout my lifetime, but as an absolute must have in a way that we've never had before. And I'm not even saying that because it's nice to. I'm saying that it's actually, whether you think it's nice to or not, it's actually because we have to as well. And clearly we need an evolution in how we do politics, so we get smarter at making good global decisions and good environmental decisions, and dealing with and taking high quality decisions that deal with this complexity. Okay. Couple of slides on just on the inequality thing. So we all think about this. This is wealth per person. We all think about the States being a really wealthy country, and there it is, looking really, really rich. But what happens if we instead put up the median wealth? So this is the wealth of somebody who, in America, who has got as many people in the country richer than them as poorer than them. And let's have a look at how that compares in different countries, coming up in yellow. And suddenly you see the States down here, and you find that actually the average person, the person in the middle in the States, is poorer than people in all these countries, poorer than people in Spain, a lot poorer than people in Spain, a lot poorer than people in Italy, even though we think of those countries as much richer than, as much poorer than America. And the reason for it is it's just the inequality thing. It's that so much of America's wealth is in the hands of just a few people. And just to emphasize it, so if you took the 10 wealthiest people in America and you shared out their wealth to the poorest half of Africa, they could quadruple the wealth of the poorest half of Africa. But what's interesting about this is that there's really good evidence, and the tipping point, is it the tipping point? No, the spirit level is a book that sums this up nicely. There's really good evidence that actually the correlation between wealth and well-being completely breaks down at quite a low level, actually, probably the sort of level that I think all of us in this room have already reached. And so it's actually not doing those 10 faces any good whatsoever to have the wealth that they've got. And you only have to look at their faces to realize that must be the case, because if that correlation continued, they'd just be in a dream of ecstasy, wouldn't they? It would just be, whoa, and of course they're no happier than you or I. But it is doing a lot of, but below that level of wealth, it does do you a lot of harm not to have it. And so there is a well-being opportunity for redistributing it around. And there's one of the ways that some people make money in the States is through, just give the States a hard time. I'm giving the States a hard time, but a lot of the things that are the worst about the States, we find them going on in this country, but to just not yet to quite such an extreme level. But one of the things, I just put this slide up, just to show how many years, how much of your life you can expect to spend in prison if you're born in different parts of the world. So if you're a male born in, it's better to be female than male if you don't want to go to prison. The women are in yellow. But if you're a male born in Louisiana, you can expect to spend nearly 2 years of your life in prison, the average male. That's before you take black males or anything like that. So I just put this up as an illustration of how we don't treat everybody with respect. I mean, there are, it's a profit-making industry, putting people in prison in some parts of the States. But it's just an illustration of how we don't treat everybody with respect, and that's something that we need to get our heads around if we're going to deal with these complex problems. Which takes me to I've left a space in the middle of that book, and it's the heart of the book, really, and it's the bit that it's amazing how many scientists and technical experts I talk to who, after the end of a long cup of coffee, would say words to the effect of, well, perhaps it all boils down to this. Perhaps it's just these things if we really want to deal with the challenges we face, and nothing else will do. And that's about our values and our thinking skills, the ways that we need to learn how to think in order to become Anthropocene fit, and the values that we need to and the values that will enable us to thrive. So I'm not talking about values from a kind of, the only reason the only credentials I have for advocating these is I just identify them from a pragmatic perspective of which values will allow us to get by. And but I'll do the thinking skills first. So to deal with all these joined up interdisciplinary challenges that we've got. So this is just a little model of 8 thinking skills that we now need to get much better at. And I'm not putting myself up as somebody who's brilliant at all 8 of these, but I do identify them as things that I think we all need to get and help each other to get better at as best we can. So we need to get much better at big picture thinking, because humans are much better at doing detail than standing back and looking at the whole thing. We need to get much better at joining up these disciplines, and especially in universities, which all I think struggle with this, is getting the disciplines really talking to each other. We need to get better at the skill of the thinking skill of global empathy, which is the ability to have an emotional reaction when you hear about something going on that affects somebody who's miles away from you, that you're never going to meet, who lives completely differently from you. We need to get better at thinking further into the future. We need to get better at appreciating the small things in the here and now, because it's not good enough anymore just to get our kicks out of rushing around ever faster and getting on planes to have a good time and stuff like that. We need to get better at the skills that are around discerning fact from fiction, or I use truth as a slight shorthand, but to understand what's going on, we need to get much better at reflecting on ourselves, on why we're thinking what we're thinking, and what emotional reactions we're having to things. And we need to get much better at asking ourselves, when we see a source of information, whether it's a politician or a newspaper or a TV or what, how do we know whether or not we can trust this source? What do we know about its expertise, its motivations, its track record, all of those things. And then the complexity and complicatedness, don't worry about that, we're doing more and more of that, as it is anyway. Okay, and now on to the values then. So these 3 values, so the first one is just so simple. Why it's so simple it doesn't need writing down, does it? And yet, if we were to live according to that value, it would have enormous implications. So just to treat every human, now that we're all on the same boat, we have to treat every human with equal respect, whichever part of the world they come from, however much money they've got, whatever they've done in their lives, whatever. And we're just such a long way away from that at the moment, and some of the things that are going on have been taking us backwards. And then second up, we need to extend that to the other species, because it doesn't take that much imagination to see that without our biodiversity, actually, we're in a lot of trouble. And the third one is that we need to get better at respecting truth for its own sake, because the complexity of the issues is now higher than ever. And if anyone wants to confuse us over this, the tools that are out there to confuse us over this are more sophisticated than ever before. And in response to that, we need to get, all of us, much more discerning and insistent on working out who and what to trust, having well-founded bases for working out who and what to trust, and for taking action if we can't trust something. And now on to this is all about taking action. So, I think this is a really important question to face head on. When it's all so global, I said we need big system change, and each one of us is just 7.7 billionth of the whole thing. And I've talked about all these rebound effects and the balloon squeezing thing. So is individual action just actually pointless or not? It turns out not to be at all, but we need to ask the question about what we can do in a different way. It's not how can I cut my carbon footprint, although that is part of it. It's an important part of it. But the real question is, what can I do to help create the conditions under which the big global system change that we need to see can become possible? And so the first thing is about imagining. We imagine. We imagine what it's going to be like not to be able to drive a petrol car or not to be able to get on an aeroplane, but we don't spend anything like enough time imagining the better world that we could have. It's not as though we've already optimized the quality of human existence and now anything else is a step down from that. So we'd all imagine this in different ways. This is just one collage of it, but it's got great communities and great food and great housing and happy people and fantastic wildlife, and there's even a little aeroplane in the corner here. Small one. We can fly for really good reasons. We just can't do it flippantly. And so, but overall, surely, it's a better life opportunity that we can have. So we need to imagine that much more. And I think one of the things that Extinction Rebellion have been doing at their very best is giving people actually a visceral taste of that in the way that they've done some of their protests. And I'd like to see a lot more of that. So next up, role model it as best we can, and that is not about being perfect or beating ourselves up, but it's not about letting ourselves off the hook either. We're all conflicted and we're all not as good as we should be. But it's about trying to move on, and it's about trying to find ways of moving on that actually make life better. Because when you do that, you bring other people with you. I'm going to skip over these slides for speed actually and just go straight on to the next one, which is about develop the thinking skills and values that I've mentioned already. And the good news is there's plenty of evidence that it is possible through deliberate effort to develop thinking skills and to develop values as well if you think they're a good idea. Fourth up is to ask, okay, so how else can I influence? How else can I push for this change? And this is, we all have different areas of influence. Maybe it's our friendship groups or our families or the places that we work in or the people we teach, or most of us in this room get to vote, and is it just about voting, or how else can I influence my politicians? What are the ways in which we can push for the big cultural change and political change that we need? And we really do need to insist on it now, because we've had decades of asking nicely. And as I've pointed out, we've got no agency over this yet. We need to get that critical transition. And it has to be now, as in 2019 was the biggest year of cultural change around this that that we've ever had. And 2020 needs to be bigger again. We need to be, if we were in a room in a year's time from now, we need to be looking back on that year and going, God, weren't things different a year ago? That was when we were just beginning to slightly wake up out of our slumber, and look how far we've come in the year since then. I mean, it really does need to be a big year. And I don't say this lightly at all. I do think that we've got to have the change. And if it's really intelligently done, and I think at their very best, Extinction Rebellion have been brilliant around this, and the school kids have been brilliant around this, and they've undoubtedly opened up political space, helped to get some changes even in our government, and certainly opened up a lot of different conversations in all the businesses I'm working with. And I think it needs to be really respectful. I think it needs to be really insistent. I really like the values that Extinction Rebellion push around truth and respecting everybody, and of course respecting all species. And I think that at their very best, they give a taste. They do it in such a way, any disruption they do it in such a way that they show how respectful they're being. And they also find a way of doing it which offers a taste of how much better the world could be if we made the change. And that's visceral, not something we have to imagine, but you actually give a taste of it. So I'm not saying they've got all the right answers, but I do think that they have got it right in that they're saying, well, look, we need action. They've thought carefully about it. They're going, if not this way, how? If not now, when? This is the best we can think of, and we'll try and learn really fast. I kind of think anyone who criticizes them needs to, my challenge to them is, okay, what is your better plan, more effective plan that you are already implementing? So I don't think that's the whole part of it, but I do think, and I don't say this lightly, I don't say this as somebody who thinks, or instinctively thinks, oh goody, let's take to the streets, that'll be fun. But I don't think like that at all. But I do think we have to have the change. And so, one way of looking at it is it's a race between tipping points. I think all this stuff is gathering momentum, serious political momentum behind, green ideas. Greta Thunberg, the world's clearest voice on climate change, has done a fantastic job, but partly because the conditions were right for people to listen to her. And Extinction Rebellion at their very best and so on. That's one side of the tipping point, but the other tipping point that's going on is, what about these are explosions in the permafrost of methane, leaving 50-meter craters, and there are thousands of these, and they've come up really recently. And we know about the fires, and we know about the melting Antarctica and so on, and all these things are potential tipping points, and maybe they're combining to a tipping point that actually we can't control. Because even if we stop even if we took very strong action right now, there's nothing we can do to stop the temperature going up higher quite a bit than where we're at now. So, we don't know whether we can make this, whether we can have the big cultural tipping point for this big system change that we need in time or not. We actually don't know the answer to that. But we do know that the harder we push, the better our chances are. And it still looks like, if we push really hard, it still looks like, for all our laziness to date, it still looks like there's a really good chance that we could, broadly speaking, get away with it. Thank you for listening.
Because that's the academic way. Here we are in a very lucky and affluent city. Is it harder for us, or perhaps easier for us, given that we've got all the tools at our fingertips?
Well, our lives are great, aren't they? And it should be easier for us because we've got so much capacity for change, not as though we're fighting to stay alive or anything like that. But I mean, I'm in the same boat as you. We all live in a we're all conflicted. None of us are squeaky clean, but none of us should let ourselves off the hook over that. So, last year I managed not to fly. I took trains to Germany and various places around, various places around Europe and so on, and found a way of making it a good experience, even if it took more time, all the rest of it. But on the other hand, I still have a car, and, this year I'm probably going to end up flying. I think we still can fly for good enough reasons, and it's down to our conscience what one of those is. I don't think we should fly flippantly anymore. I think it is important for universities really seriously to be looking at flying less. And there are opportunities in that, because half the conferences that academics go to be honest, are a waste of time and a costly waste of time. Not always.
Well, the trick is knowing in advance which ones are a waste of time.
Yeah, and we need to get our video conferencing, really working properly. I did a TEDx talk with the States, and I said, I'm not flying out. Of course, I'm not flying out to do it. So we'll do it by video. And they said, yeah, we'll make an exception for you because of what your talk's about. So we did it all, and it turned out to be, to be honest, the way the IT was sorted out. I won't name and shame who it was with, but they ought to have known better. But, it just could have been a lot better. And if we get smoother at that kind of stuff, then now we're doing it. Lots of the people who are watching this now aren't actually in the room for practical reasons. And we're making it work properly, so hopefully it's a good experience for them. We need to get better at that.
So on that subject, those that are listening on the live stream, if you want to send in questions, either Twitter, Facebook, the hashtag CCLS2020, and we'll try and receive and transmit questions. Right, so questions from the room. I think we've got a microphone on that side, and I think we've got a microphone over here. And right, so, we start. Well, we do have a question just here, right, to start with.
Thanks. So you talk a bit in the book about consumerism and how we can be more critical and conscious in our consumption, but do you want to talk about how that fits in?
Yeah, sure. So we've got a world in which we've got used to just we see something on the shelf and we ask ourselves whether we like the look of it and whether it will make ourselves feel happy for the next few minutes if we buy it, and we just buy it. And we've got out of the habit of asking, well, what lies behind that product? How did it get to be there? What were the impacts behind it? Who made it? What was their life like? All those kinds of questions need to be routinely going through our heads now. And so, if we can get into that habit, then I think we'll start feeling differently about different kinds of things, and we will tune out of this kind of just buying junk that actually clothes we don't wear and all the rest of it, and we'll feel better about things like, so I noticed you're wearing a Patagonia jacket there, and your Patagonia are now saying, well, if you buy clothing from us, we will repair it for you anytime you like, ever, free of charge. Well, that's a totally different way of, so you probably feel better about, now that you've got your head around that, you feel better about wearing it for that reason. And we can all, if we tune into that, we'll all get better and better and better at it. But it's something we've forgotten about.
We have a question over here.
Thanks for a really interesting talk, and kind of more of a comment. And I was very interested, you said that there isn't a simple technical solution for renewable energy flying, and that's something we've got to cut back on. So I suppose I just slightly disagree with your statement saying don't fly flippantly, we can still fly if we've got a good enough reason. Everyone sitting on a plane thinks they've got a good enough reason to be on the plane, otherwise they wouldn't be on it.
Yeah, no, you're right.
We still have to cut back. So I think that's quite a dangerous
I agree.
phrasing. And it also the chair saying, that's just the way academia is. Well, it's got to change.
Yes, I agree. It's not just the way academia is. Academia needs to change. But I also agree with you. It's a very slippery and dangerous slope to say it's down to our consciences. I agree with that. But I also think that we can have some flying, and it's important to have some flying. And we really can actually. If we sort everything out, people talk about sustainable aviation fuel. Well, okay, it has a very high energy cost to it. Probably the best way of doing it is solar panels creating electricity, and from that creating synthetic hydrocarbons and so on. But it does put a pressure on the system. There's no doubt about that. And it all goes on at high altitude, and that has the high altitude effects make it even worse. And direct air capture is a technology that we need like crazy as best we can do it, but it's still going to be a limit to how much we can do it. So there is a pressure on that, but we can still have some of it. But I think if global flying, I could imagine us making a proper response to climate change in which there's possibly half as much flying in the world as there is now, which means that all of us could fly for a really good reason. Our kids could see the world, as they grow up, and get that. That will help them get the global empathy that we need. And there are some business trips. And, this year I'm going to fly, I think, for maybe 2 business trips that I can't do without flying, and which I think I can justify. And I know it's a slippery slope, but we also need to really challenge ourselves. Yeah.
So a question here, yeah.
Hi, Mike. Thanks for your talk and thanks for your books. Hey, I'm here. Yeah, you really are an inspiration to me and a lot of my friends, a lot of the people I know. My question is, you said it's time to call out the fossil fuel industries.
Yeah, it really is.
And my question relates to Cambridge University and its £377 million that is currently invested in fossil fuels.
Yeah.
And on top of that, the £6 million that's just been accepted in November for further oil extraction research. And I was wanting to hear what you have to say about that.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, well done. Yeah. It's a really good question, and I also really like what you've just done, which is like calling it out so that things that shouldn't be happening become increasingly difficult to just carry on with, because it probably feels a bit embarrassing to ask questions like that, but actually, when somebody does it, makes it easier for the next person to do it, and it makes it more difficult to carry on with that fossil fuel investment. And when the pension funds and the asset managers are working out whether they really need to get the fossil fuel out of their pension funds or not, a lot of it boils down to how loudly is the public screaming about how uncomfortable they are with it. How much is Cambridge University getting a sense that if it doesn't get out of fossil fuels, the brightest people are going to want to come here significantly less, and some of them will choose somewhere else instead. You know, when that starts happening, you know, so that's how we build the pressure for it, and it's really important. And the fossil fuel companies deserve a mention here because they are really, you know, the greenwash that is coming out from them is truly awful and needs calling out. And I had to do this at a Shell conference about 6 months ago, where, you know, the chief exec stood up and said a whole lot of stuff. And then I got 5 minutes, and Kevin Anderson, who's a good, very good climate, he got 5 minutes as well. And we both of us just said, look, you've just been hearing a load of rubbish. And it was uncomfortable, you know, it was uncomfortable, but, you know, it has to be called out because they are still saying, oh yes, 1.5 degrees is so, so important. Oh yes, we're going to help the world to make the transition. But if you listen carefully, they are also saying we're going to rip more and more fossil fuel out of the ground. And it just absolutely doesn't stack up. And they know it doesn't stack up, and it needs calling out.
Well, there was a radio program recently where there was a Shell person speaking about low carbon energy. And they seem to be able to define what they mean by low carbon energy. And I think it turned out to be a gas with 15% hydrogen.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's a low carbon fuel.
Well, gas is lower carbon than coal per kilowatt hour.
But we've got to, it's got to be clear when we're having conversations.
Yeah, and it's got to be, and to be knowingly disingenuous like that has got to become embarrassing.
Yeah, that's right.
It's like, are you too stupid to have worked this out yourself, or are you too dishonest to have put us in the picture properly? Because otherwise, yeah, either way is no good. Yeah.
We've got a question. Yeah.
First of all, thanks very much for having a slide on what we can do, because having worked in the environmental consultancy field for a number of years, it can get a bit depressing. And then to my question is, we have a COP meeting in Glasgow coming up this year. Do you have any faith in the COP process? Sub-question, what can we do to influence it, also not being sort of a born and bred campaigner at heart?
Yeah, well, okay, so we're in the same boat. We're not born and bred campaigners at heart. However, we've sort of realised that we need to take some action on this. So what do I think for the COP? Well, I think, you know, I don't know whether the COP can pull it off or not. You know, I'm not a determinist. I think it's possible. It needs to be really good. And I'm not the perfect expert on where the UK government's coming from. I have a sort of weirdly naive hope for Boris, actually, that he might just be capable of rising to the challenge. But one thing I do think is that the UK is looking to have some respect in the international community, and potentially at the moment one of the ways in which we might be most respected is to be doing the right thing on climate change. And it's important that we make it really clear the kinds of things that the UK government will get away with when they go into that COP and the kinds of things they won't. So one example, we've got a plan in Cumbria to open up a new coal mine. It's totally absurd, right? And, you know, everybody needs to be very clear that we'll look absolutely embarrassed if that goes ahead, because there'll be campaigners all over the place at the COP, and every single delegate at that COP will find themselves asking the question at some point, why is the UK opening up that coal mine? It will be incredibly embarrassing for the UK, and there are other things as well, you know, but positive things that we can let them, you know we'd support.
So we've got a question from #CCLS2020. So lots of new technologies that are going to be coming on stream. We're going to be using them, and I guess there might be a few cowboys in the game. So how do we regulate the technologies that we should adopt?
So I put that challenge out about how we get agency over our technology, and you know what? I'm a long way from the perfect answers to it. You know, it's incredibly difficult at the moment. So just looking at the IT industry as one example, has this lovely dream idea that it's just a force for good in the world. You know, it brings about all this technology and all this efficiency improvement, and the technology itself is becoming more efficient, and therefore surely it's just helping the world to get lower carbon. Actually, if you look really hard at what's going on, it's a much more plausible argument is to say that The technology enables efficiency improvements, and the default impact of an efficiency improvement is to enable an even greater burden on resources, because the amount we do goes up even more, right? So we get 1 million times more efficient with our storage and transfer of information, and you know what? We store and transfer millions and millions and millions of times more information, and so the burden goes up. And you see that across almost every field of human existence, unless you find a way of putting the brakes on. So it's just how do we put the brakes? So that takes us back to we need to leave the fossil fuel in the ground.
Yep.
Hello, thank you for your talk. You mentioned the fossil fuel companies, and it's been a big story in the news in the last couple of days that BP has set a net zero target, and we've been hearing an increasing number of these net zero targets. And I was wondering what you think about net zero as an idea versus what other people are saying, like a gross zero or real zero.
Yeah, okay. So what I think about net zero, I think it's a slippery concept, but under the right circumstances, it's viable, right? So interestingly, I've just had a big corporation ask us to do a paper for them on what do we think a legitimate net zero proposition looks like. Because, so to give you an example of one that I think is tenable, right? So, because in terms of carbon dioxide, if we just take it's all about cumulative emissions. If we take the emissions down on, let's say, an exponential decay curve, that never actually needs to get to gross zero, right? So if you take something like, so BT, for example, has got targets to cut its supply chain carbon right to net zero. It can't get to absolute zero because its supply chains are all over the world, and realistically, but if it does the right kind of offset, I hate that word, but the right kind of removal, right? And it really does need to be provably additional removal, which means tree planting doesn't count because we already need to plant the trees, so it's not additional. But if you really did invest in the direct air capture, right, additional direct air capture, which is an incredibly expensive, really expensive thing to do, then I think, yes, you could argue the case for a legitimate net zero. But that only is legitimate if you're already doing everything you can to cut your emissions, right? And you've got a case that says there's a little bit at the end of the tank that we absolutely can't take out, so we're going to do the absolute best thing we can, which is to remove the carbon that we emit again in a way that we can prove is properly additional.
It has to be proved. It's got to be
provably properly additional, and planting trees doesn't count because we already need to plant all the trees that we can.
If I want to go to see my family in Melbourne, I get offered £30 to offset my flight.
Yeah, that's a total joke.
And
However, if they were to, I've done this calculation for San Francisco. Is that about the same distance as Melbourne? No, Melbourne's far further, isn't it? Right, so San Francisco and back, it's about a ton each way if you fly economy, a lot more if you don't. And so something like £100 a tonne for direct air capture is a believable future price. It's more like $1,000 a tonne at the moment, but it's believable that in a couple of years it might be £100 a tonne. So £200 on top of your return flight to San Francisco. I'm hesitant over this because I still think it's letting us off lightly.
But the thing is that my thinking of this is, and this is a Kevin Anderson thought, that if £200 offsets the carbon, then if I paid $400,
you could do it
then
twice.
It's carbon negative. In fact, the more we fly, if we pay $400, we'll save the planet. So it can't really be right, can it?
If you're already, so that's the other criteria, is if you're already doing everything you can reasonably to
that's the thing.
Right.
So we've got a question here.
Does nuclear energy have a role?
Well,
I'm not a fan of it.
No, nor am I. But
does it have a role?
It's a really good question. It might. If there's any country in the... the old arguments for and against nuclear power belong to a previous era in which we weren't in a flat-out climate emergency. So the risks and opportunities of with or without nuclear are different from what they were even 10 years ago, right? So we all need to do, everyone from Jonathan Porritt to the nuclear industry, everybody needs to do new thinking on this. If there's any country in the world where nuclear power could be a good idea, we've got to be up there in the top ones because our energy mix is so complex. It's a bit of sun and it's a bit of wind and it's a bit of tidal and it's what do you do under these different weather conditions, and if a bit of stable nuclear will help make the whole of the rest of the energy mix work, then, you know, if that case is arguable anywhere, it's here. But on the other hand, it's really expensive. It does have risks associated with it. It's not environmentally wonderful. It's not something that should make anyone's heart sing, really. And in order, and I said this to the nuclear industry, if there is a case for it, in order for that case to be justified, what is required, and we should never say yes to it without this, is a really high quality, joined up analysis of the whole UK energy thing, joining up all the different parts of the energy industries. The nuclear industry isn't even talking to itself properly at the moment, right? And in the absence, and it needs to be trusted and impartial, so that we know that we trust that the vested interests aren't driving the decision. We're a long way from being able to have that high quality debate about anything at the moment. But in the absence of that, we should say no to nuclear, right? But if we did have that, well, let's see where that argument took us. It might argue for nuclear. Yeah.
Hi. Thank you very much for the talk, and let me just say that I really enjoyed reading your book. My question to you is about decisions. So you mentioned quite a few times during the talk about, actually the person just next to me, about when is the right time to fly. My question to you is, how do you decide who is to fly and who isn't? And what is a good time to fly? And actually that extends to other decisions in life, because currently we have a mechanism to make these decisions, and that's the free market, right? And if more people want to fly, then more airlines put more flights up. Do we have to change that mechanism, or do we have to rejig it by something like a carbon tax? And at the end of the day, who makes the decisions?
Yes. Well, so yes, we need a carbon tax. If you just applied a carbon tax, you'd be saying you can fly if you're rich, right? Yeah. And that's a really unfair way of doing it. And I've already called, and I could have talked a lot more about it, I've already called for a lot less inequality in the world. So I'm sympathetic to the ideas along the lines of frequent flyer, exponential taxes. You can pay £100 a tonne for your first tonne of flying emissions, but you pay 200 for your second tonne's worth and 400 for your third tonne's worth. I'm sympathetic to something on that. And then actually, you know what? If somebody flew 10 times in a year, it'd be fine, because by that stage, the money they'd be pumping into it would be, be very seriously useful.
You've talked a lot about the need for change, the change in how we think about things, how we change in our values, and that we need something moving on from the market economy.
Yes.
Which allows us to allocate resources in a way which is better for the planet and for all of us. Do you see any signs, given that we've got the rampant populism in this country and in America and growing elsewhere, do you see any green shoots anywhere that this sort of thing is happening?
Such a good question, because it feels like we've gone so far backwards over the last 3 or 4 years, and compared to the direction we need to be travelling in at super high speed. So what do I think about it? I think some of the things, and I'll pick out Brexit and Trump, we can debate that, but for me, the way that those decisions were made, the decision-making process was so broken and useless. But one of the things that both those things were expressions of were that not everybody in the world is treated right. Even within some of these really rich countries like the UK and the US, a lot of people just aren't treated respectfully. And sure enough, that comes out to bite. And we need to get on top of that. And so if people in Louisiana weren't living in a world where you've got to watch your back the whole time to make sure you're not banged up in prison, maybe the quality of thought going, a different kind of decision-making process would go to the ballot box. And the same for us over here. Some green shoots, I think that the people's assemblies and the citizens' juries that are going on at the moment, and I was at the National Citizens' Assembly last weekend, and I'm just about to be in some citizens' juries. I think they are really optimistic experiments in the evolution of democracy that we need to enable us to make high-quality, complex decisions about things that really matter in ways that are properly representative of the people who are affected by it. There's a green shoot for you.
Hi, thanks for your talk. I'm going to have to word this sort of carefully, but you had very stark trends for sort of the increase of energy and the growth that we have, and how much solar we would need to have if we continue on the same trends. And I imagine that that graph is quite closely tied to population growth. And I'm not recommending any specific measures to be taken, but do you see sort of a natural stabilization in population growth, or how do you see population growth playing a role in tackling energy consumption?
I should change my talk because I always get asked about population, and I always wish I talked about it more, because it is an important part of the mix. There's no doubt about it. But on the other hand, it's not the one thing that some people think it is. So 12 billion careful people could live really nicely on this planet. We have to be careful about it. 1 billion careless people will trash the place in no time, right? So, but equally, the fewer of us there are, the easier it is to make it work. So it's absolutely part of the equation, and the problems that are lining up for, let's say, Africa with population growth now, I mean, they're just making life so much harder. The bigger that population goes, the harder it's going to be. So the good news about population is you don't need to go and enforce a population, a childbirth ban, because there's pretty good evidence that if you sort out the right things like inequality and human rights and education, especially rights for women, what you find is that population naturally tails off. That's great. And what does it mean in this country, where our population growth in terms of our birth rate and so on, is broadly in hand. But I mean, I do think that I'm the youngest of 4, so I'm really glad that my parents had 4 kids. But I think anybody planning their family size now, and I don't want to be prescriptive, but it has to be in the equation, doesn't it? It has to be a factor in the equation that the fewer the better, in a way.
Mike.
Hiya. Thank you for the talk and all your books, they're fantastic. I was going to ask a similar question to what the man down at the front just asked about right-wing populism, so I'm going to phrase it a bit differently. Which is that, I think all of us being in this room and watching you is all very great, but let's face it, you're preaching to the converted. And I think one of the issues that one of the damaging things that I think have risen in the last couple of decades around these issues is that it has become very politically polarized. Yeah. And that is artificial. It didn't exist in the 80s, and it was largely driven by a lot of very well-funded think tanks and companies who are spreading misinformation.
Yes. And
so I feel like if we're going to really deal with this issue, we need to be able to communicate with people across the political spectrum and try and get people, with right-wing views to understand these issues and communicate in a way that means something to them. And we are now in a situation where, even in this country, most people with right-wing views do care and think that climate change is real and are worried about it.
Yes.
But it's not seeing action. So I was wondering if you have some thoughts about that.
Yeah, I do. Yeah. So first of all, you're absolutely right to call out the billions of dollars of misinformation that has been very effective at slowing down our response on climate change. So one of the, another criteria that a university pension fund could have, for example, is it investing in any company that is funding misinformation directly or indirectly? That would be another criteria you could add in. But in terms of, it's all got polarized, and some people are, right into this and they get it and they want to take action, and other people don't get it at all. And which parts of society are engaged with this? I think it's a really good challenge. I think when people tried to stereotype Extinction Rebellion, in its early days in the April protests, I think all those attempts to make one stereotype stick largely failed, because actually there was quite a broad cross-section of people in there. But one of the things I've been, I'm just playing with ideas, but an idea I have about Extinction Rebellion, I talk about how they need to help everyone to imagine that how the change that they're pushing for is good for everybody. And one of the things you could do as protest is go and do things in really beaten up parts of the country where your protest largely takes the form of offering free, really tasty, sustainable food, street food to people, or something like that. So they're really showing, we are a positive movement. We care about everybody. We stand for a better world. And if we do any disruption, for a very good reason, the backdrop is that we do all these brilliant, really positive things. And I think that is the way of engaging everybody. And for everybody, we need to find ways of making everybody not scared about it. You know, I did a talk to my local Conservative group recently. And we had a really thoughtful conversation about it. You know, even though I know most of them were, you know, well, we had some differences. I just want to say that this whole debate has to absolutely transcend traditional political guidance. And if I was to pick my government now, you know, from all the MPs I can think of, you know, I would actually have some Tories in there. I'll just say that quickly to, you know, because it does have to transcend.
Could you share with us your views of the geopolitical effects of climate change, like human displacement?
Sorry, say it again?
Like the geopolitical effects of climate change, like human displacement around the world.
Sure. Okay, so it's going to trigger some of that. And I think we're going to see more and more of that. And if we think that we can take the Fortress Britain approach to it and just say, well, we'll clamp down on immigration, we absolutely kid ourselves that we can protect ourselves from a global crisis like this. If life gets really uncomfortable for large numbers of people around the world, we are just way too globally dependent in all kinds of ways to be able to protect ourselves. And if if we can't see from the little bits of terrorism and stuff that we've had if we can't see how fragile the global order is, and the need to preserve it by having a fundamental goodwill, you know, around the world to preserve that, and the reason for that, you know, the way to have that is to create a world order in which everybody is respected. So that, you know, we absolutely have to do that, and you know, immigration pressures, in the absence of that, are going to be surely enormous all over the place. Yeah.
So we're coming to the end of our time. One last question up the back there.
Okay, so slightly fun, maybe with a not of a small bit of importance in it, question. Most of us here have the global empathy already. That's why we are here. Now, how do you envisage stimulating or enfranchising the sociopaths of this planet?
Okay, so I'm not a psychologist, and I'm not an expert on sociopaths either. But what do I think about... So what does it take to grow global empathy? And I'm not an expert on this either, but some of the things that I think, you know, clearly do help. So when I say that it's good for young people to go and see the world a bit, if it's a proper experience of seeing the world, as in not going off to stay in hotels that are just like the ones that are down the road and stuff, but it's a proper cultural experience, I think that's really helpful, because then when you see it on the news, you think, oh my goodness, you know. And like, there's no doubt about it, I relate more strongly to news items that I see that are countries that feel like places I've been to. That's the truth of it. And but there are other ways as well, and one of them is just to stop and spend time thinking ourselves into other people's shoes. And you know, I think so. One of the things I think that saddened me around the Brexit thing, and I don't mean to be I don't want to take particular political positions on it, but one of the things that I think saddened me about the way that whole debate happened was there was so little thinking about, well, what's in the best interests of the rest of the world, actually. Never mind us thinking, oh, what's going to be best for the UK? You know, what's in Europe's interest? Because we have to get better at thinking like that, and I think we can with practice. It's like a decision to make.
Well, that's been a wonderful hour and a half. The Cambridge Climate Lecture Series has got off to a great start with your talk. Thanks, Mike. So, big round of applause for Mike.